Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Philosophy 105. Today, we are getting our history of philosophy off to a start with the Milesians. So, as you know, we are working through Anthony Kenny's History of Western Philosophy. And then also for this week, I've got some selections from Edward Hussey's The Pre-Socratics. I think he's a pretty excellent writer about the pre-Socratics, and he goes a little bit deeper than what Anthony Kenny can. Now, of course, Edward Hussey has the advantage that he is only dealing with ancient philosophy, whereas Anthony Kenny is going from the pre-Socratics all the way up to basically the present day. So let me get situated here. One second. Just a note, I will be speaking. Oops, sorry. I will be speaking a bit slow on this recording, and I want to do that so that people can listen at a speed that is comfortable to them, and you can take notes or reference, your reading or whatever while I'm lecturing. If you find that annoying, which I know a lot of people find slow talking very annoying, um, you can go down to the settings and actually increase the playback speed, I think up to 2x. I know people that, watch YouTube and listen to podcasts like minimum 1.5x all the time. I don't know how they do it. That would drive me crazy, but I get it. Time is precious. So let's go ahead and get started here with the Milesians. So we're beginning this week with pre-Socratic philosophy. First question. We covered what philosophy was last week, or at least we started to cover what philosophy is. But what's this pre-Socratic business all about? What does pre-Socratic mean? Well, I mean, the straightforward answer is that it's a name given to a group of philosophers before pre-Socrates, Socratic. Socratic, the word Socratic is just a sort of adjectival form of the name Socrates. If you've studied education or teaching at all, you may have heard of the Socratic method. We'll talk more about that next week as we're covering Socrates. The Socratic method is just a method of teaching where you instruct your students simply with questions. You don't necessarily give them answers, you just ask the right questions. So the pre-Socratic philosophers began in Miletus, a city in the Asia Minor sort of side. I'll show you on a map on the Mediterranean. And the pre-Socratic period obviously ends with Socrates around the mid 5th century BC. Socrates was such an important moment in philosophy that we give his name, sort of his career splits philosophy between the pre-Socratic, everything that came before Socrates, and then everything that came after him. So here's a picture I just pulled from Wikipedia. I couldn't get the source because the page was no longer up, but for some reason the image showed up in image searches. So I just wanted to show you here on the timeline. Socrates, let's see if you can. Socrates is around here, around 450 BC. So all of the philosophers that we're covering are to the left of him on this timeline here. So we're looking at about 600 BC to about 450 BC. Yes, so um here is the map. So this is the pre-Socratic Greek world. The spellings of the cities here are a little funky compared to how we spell it in modern English, but that's okay. Um, Pay attention here. I kind of think of this map in three basic regions. So over to the east, over here you have Asia Minor and its Greek coast. In the middle, you have mainland Greece. And then over to the west, you have that familiar boot of Italy there. Now, most of our action is going to occur around here in a place called Ionia. But before we get into the pre-Socratics, how did the Greeks think about the world before philosophy became a thing? How were they thinking about the gods? How were they thinking about nature? All of that kind of thing. Edward Hussey has a pretty good strategy in his book, I think, which is looking at Hesiod as a potential point of comparison. So Hesiod was a poet who preceded the pre-Socratic period. So, like I said, pre-Socratic is about 600 to 450. Hesiod died sometime around 650, so he's outside of that scope. But the Theogony is a poem that he wrote. It's a very early example of Greek literature. And it is Hesiod's attempt to give a genealogy of all of the gods. So, theogony just meaning the creation, goni, creation of the theo gods. Now, Hesiod is interesting because he inherits the tradition. So, a lot of the gods that he's writing about are just part of Greek culture. He's not necessarily creating them, and he's not even really trying to justify their existence. He just inherits a tradition from the Greek culture and says, yeah, of course there's Zeus, of course there's all of these other gods. But he does try to correct traditional religion to a certain extent. He provides original additions to that traditional Greek pantheon based on what he finds reasonable or on the natural phenomena that he thinks needs more explanation, right? So, in a way, Hesiod's activity is kind of a precursor to the philosophers that will come after him because he is questioning tradition. One second here. Oh, I've got my technology all messed up. There we go. Apologies. I'm just trying to get my Zoom figured out. Okay. Very good. So Milesian philosophy here I've zoomed in a little bit on the coast of Ionia. So you'll notice there is the cities we especially need to keep in mind here are Miletus, here spelled Miletos, but it's just an alternate spelling. Samos, Ephesus, and Colophon. I never know if I'm pronouncing that right. I think it's Colophon. I'm going to go with Colophon. Okay, so on the Ionian coast, there is a city called Miletus. And in at the start of the pre-Socratic period, there is an increase in foreign trade happening. So before this period was the Mycenaean civilization, sort of very early Greece, experienced a rapid decline, right? So the people of Miletus are going to be coming out of a period of cultural decline, and they're going to be coming into contact through foreign trade with a lot of very ancient cultures like Babylonia, Egypt. They're going to come into contact with monotheism from Zoroaster and the Zoroastrian religion. They may even come into contact with the writings of the Hebrew prophets to some degree. And this is really important. They come into contact with the Phoenicians, from whom they take an alphabet. What's interesting here is I've seen some estimates. I don't know exactly what to believe, but some people say that the adoption of the Phoenician alphabet increased the literacy rate in this region to almost 30%, which at this time period is 1 in 3 people can read. That's big. Of course, initially the alphabet is adopted so that traders, merchants can keep records and everything else, but eventually it gets out to the different classes of people. One other really important development here that sets the stage for philosophy to be practiced is the emergence of oligarchy. Now, oligarchy is a form of government in which a select elite few make the decisions in terms of law and order and legislation, everything like that. So it's not a democracy in the sense that not every citizen gets a say, but a certain class of people, probably wealthy landowners, get a say in the government. Now, this actually is a really momentous development, because now power, instead of coming from a king, coming from a monarch, coming from some unquestionable authority, now power is distributed amongst a group of people that now need to argue with each other in order to make decisions. So when you have the oligarchy in place, suddenly you have the need to appeal to an impartial law or some impartial objective truth that is beyond the opinions of any of the participants, right? So when it was a monarchy, the king would say, do X, do Y, whatever. And that's what you did. You didn't question it. And if you did question it, you probably got in trouble. But with oligarchy, we have these arguments, we have competing opinions. We now need to appeal to reason. We need to appeal to objective truth. We need to appeal to some higher law. Now, this notion of higher law is going to become very, very important as we move through this history. So the point here is just that these political and social developments are set the stage for new developments in thought, right? Now, one moment. Okay. So, oops. So Milesian philosophy. Now we've set the stage of these sort of cultural and political factors that are going to lead to this new type of reasoned discourse. And in pre-Socratic philosophy, in Miletus, there are 3 main, I guess you would call them, I don't know, rock stars of Milesian philosophy. These are the first three sort of big names in Greek philosophy. The first one is Thales, and he lived approximately 625 to 545. And then we have his associate Anaximander. We think that Anaximander and Thales knew each other, and we know that Anaximander died around 547. And then Anaximenes, who's probably a bit younger, he we don't have his exact dates, but that FL there just means flourished. He flourished 546 to 525 BC. So we have his we know when his career was going really well, I guess is how I would put it. So these three are often called either the first philosophers or the first scientists. Now, it's important to remember that philosophy and science aren't yet distinct, right? So they do a lot of proto-science and they do a lot of proto-philosophy, but whether they're actually doing strictly philosophy or strictly science, that would be a matter of dispute. Something that they shared in common was a dissatisfaction with traditional religious explanations of things. This is something that's very common during this period. And they have a kind of a concept of the divine as a single, boundless deity that infuses the universe, that encompasses it, and that sort of controls the different cycles of the universe. And we'll go way deeper into this in this lecture. In Milesian philosophy and in pre-Socratic philosophy in general, there's a desire to discover a kind of a single plan or a single set of laws that govern the universe. I also just want to point out down here in the corner, left corner, anything in the yellow is going to be from a citation from the pre-Socratics, and anything in pink is going to be a citation from the New History of Western Philosophy. All right, so the Milesians have a central question, and that question is, what are the relations between the supreme power in the universe, the divine, and the observable world order? We need to parse out how there is this all-pervasive unity in the world, and yet in our everyday experience, there seem to be, discrete objects. I have a book, I have a remote control. These are separate things. And yet they're part of a single world, right? Any explanation for how discrete identities can arise out of this infinite divinity has to make sense of two things. It needs to square with the observable facts. That's the sort of proto-scientific angle. And it also needs to square with necessary truths about divinity. That's the proto-philosophical angle. Now, there are two key ideas that we take away from the Milesians. There are more than two, but these are the big ones. The first one is a Greek word called apeiron. Now, think in terms of like the word atheism, for example. Atheism means not theism, not God, not believing in God, right? So a here is a negative prefix, and peron means completion. So that doesn't necessarily mean incomplete, it means uncompletable. So let's think about this. If something's uncompletable, I kind of think about it as, can we draw a line around something? I can draw a circle around this remote and I can complete the circle, right? But if I try to draw a circle around the infinite, you're never going to complete that circle. That's sort of how I think about the incompletable. A more common translation is the unbounded. So if you think about that circle or that uh, perimeter as a bound, the unbounded or the infinite, which notice too that both of those words are also negatives, not bounded, not finite. So this infinity, this unbounded divinity that pervades everything, is what keeps the world together. It makes the world a single world, even though there is a multiplicity of things that arise and fall. There are cycles of seasons and day and night. There's change. And yet this all occurs within a single cosmos. And it occurs within a single cosmos because the infinite holds the cosmos together. One other important aspect of the infinite is that it supplies power to the finite world. It moves the stars, it moves the planets, it moves the seasons, right? There are all sorts of natural cycles that just keep going and going and going. And on this sort of Milesian view, the infinite or the deity or the divine is responsible for maintaining those cycles and keeping them moving. Now, the sort of the opposite term to the infinite is the cosmos, which in Greek is very similar to how we spell it in English, just with a K. Now, in contrast to the infinite, the cosmos is not divine. It has a beginning, it has an end. It emerges from the infinite, it's created by the infinite, the unbounded, but it is finite in space and time, right? We could theoretically, on this view, we could theoretically draw a circle around the cosmos. Now let's talk about Milesian cosmogony. Now, cosmogony just means the genesis or the creation or the origin of the cosmos. How did it come about that the cosmos arrived in the state that it's in? So the question here is, how does the unbounded create and sustain a finite cosmos? The Milesians demanded a cosmogony, right? A theory of the origin of the universe that made both empirical and speculative sense. Now, they wouldn't put it in those terms, but the point here is, right, they're doing at the same time a study of nature, right? So whatever they say about how the world came to be, it can't contradict the observable facts of nature. And it needs to make speculative sense, which means that the way they're reasoning about the infinite, the way they're reasoning about the divine, this cosmogony needs to fit in with those insights as well. Okay. 1 second. Okay, so that brings us to our first Milesian philosopher, Thales. Now, Thales was born probably around 625 BC and died probably around 545 BC. We don't have any writings from him, but we have two sayings. The first is that all things are full of gods. And the second is that water is the first principle of everything. Now, Thales was a man of many talents. He was a geometer and an astronomer and a meteorologist. There's also two pretty funny anecdotes here. The first is that he, because of his wisdom, because of his knowledge of the seasons and his understanding of nature, he was able to predict a massive crop of olives. And so what he did is he bought up all of the olive presses and leased them out, um, and made a lot of money, right? He could see that olive presses were going to be in huge demand, and he knew, because of his observation of nature, that they were going to have a huge olive crop. So he took advantage of that and he made a lot of money. And Aristotle uses this example to show that philosophers could make a lot of money if we wanted to, right? Another story comes from Plato. He relayed this anecdote here, that Thales was staring at the stars. Right? He was an astronomer and a meteorologist. He's concerned with the movement of the heavenly bodies, and he's walking around looking at the stars and considering their movements and things, and falls into a well. Right? Now, um, Plato uses this as an example of the critique that philosophers can sometimes be very absent-minded. Right? They can have their head in the clouds and they're not watching where they're going, and they end up falling to the bottom of a well. So, in addition to all of that, he is the pioneer of natural philosophy. He really sought to explain nature with a single principle. And as far as we can tell, it seems like he held that water was the fundamental principle of all things. He also thought that the earth was supported by water, that it was kind of either floating on water or somehow rested on water. And this would have squared really well with some of the ancient Near Eastern cosmology. If you look in the Old Testament of the Bible, for example, the Hebrew Bible, you'll notice there's a lot about the waters underneath the earth and the waters above the firmament, right? This is a common picture of the world at the time. So this wouldn't have been surprising, I guess, is what I'm saying. Why water? Probably because it's necessary for life. We don't quite know exactly why Thales gave us water as the first principle, because we don't have any of his writings. But from what we can tell, it seems that water being necessary for life is important. Now, if you remember a couple slides ago, one of the key phenomena that pre-Socratic philosophers have to explain is how the divine vivifies the cosmos, how it supplies motion and power to the cosmos. So if you connect water with a principle of life, then that might be a connection that Thales was making, right? Water is how life emerges and how, you know, the natural cycles continue. Now, Anaximander, contemporary of Thales, is credited with a few firsts as well. He had the first map of the world and the first star chart, the first Greek sundial. But he was also a natural philosopher. He wrote a book called On Nature. There's going to be quite a few quite a few philosophers that write a book called On Nature. As far as I understand, I think Anaximander is the first one to write On Nature. He taught that the earth is cylindrical, And he also had this very kind of bizarre understanding of the heavenly bodies, that the sun and stars and things are sort of bowls or are holes in almost tires or wheels, and through the holes you see fire, and these wheels are turning, right? And that explains all of the motions of the stars and the sun and the moon up in the sky. He also had what I think is a fascinating theory of the origin of humanity. Um, so, you might be tempted to think that if you didn't have an understanding of evolution, you would say, well, humans have always been this way. But Anaximander understood that humans can't survive childhood unaided, right? We are born without the ability to take care of ourselves, which means we must have been different in the past, right? So this isn't necessarily a scientific or observed theory of evolution. This is a theory of evolution that um, uh, arises because of a logical problem, right? Which makes it a bit more philosophical than scientific. So he suggested that we must have been fish-like creatures, and we emerged from the water probably around puberty and shed our bark and became the kind of things that we are now, right? Humans sort of came out of these almost like fish shells. And from that, he held that we probably shouldn't eat fish. So there are a few ways in which Anaximander has a more sophisticated um, cosmology than Thales. First of all, like we said, Thales said that the Earth rested on water. Anaximander said that the Earth doesn't need a support. Now, he holds this on the basis of symmetry. So he thinks that the cosmos is a perfect sphere or some shape that has a center, and that the Earth is at the center of the cosmos. And so it has no reason to move, right? This is a little bit of a subtler way to theorize about the location of the Earth relative to the rest of the universe. He also held that the ultimate material cannot be an observable element like water. This is where things get pretty interesting. Oops. Sorry, I keep messing things up. Okay, I think I have my program situated now. I apologize. Um the the shortcuts for Zoom don't appear to be working the way they're supposed to. Surprise, surprise. Okay, so Anaximander held that uh, the universe could not be explainable on the basis of a observable element. Instead, the ultimate principle has to be unbounded, right? Aperon, the infinite, the unbounded, no beginning, no end, not a particular thing. So Anaximander made an observation. There are seasonal cycles. You have fall, you have winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer. It happens again and again and again. There's day and night, day and night, day and night. It happens again and again and again. The point is that the cosmos fluctuates. It changes, but it changes with some degree of regularity. So here's his theory. The universe is a field of competing opposites, these forces that will encroach upon each other's territory and then recede, right? So it's this back and forth ebb and flow between a multiplicity of different forces that are pushing the universe back and forth between each other in a way, or dominating the universe uh, and then receding again and again, right? So an example of these opposites would be hot and cold or dry and wet. So you might say that the the force of hot is in some way encroaching upon the force of cold when I heat up my coffee or something. So there's a principle of reciprocity with these forces. The principle of reciprocity means that when the opposites encroach upon one another, they then have to pay a penalty to each other, right? So basically what that means is anytime, for example, it is daytime, well, the sun has to go down, it has to become night. Well, then the night is encroaching upon the day's territory. And so at dawn, night has to pay the penalty and fade away as the day comes to dominate. And this happens again and again, over and over. And this is basically, this theory is supposed to explain the ebb and flow of physical reality. Another way that this is explained is injustice and requital, right? One opposite encroaches upon another one, and this is considered an injustice. It's some kind of imbalance, you might say. And then there's a requital, a restitution of unjust gains. It's interesting the way that Anaximander thinks about the oscillation of forces in the natural world as competing, as kind of almost in this litigious kind of way. It makes sense, I guess, if you think about Miletus being a town with a lot of merchants and traders and things. You think about how they're discovering a kind of proto-democratic approach to law, an appeal to law. It makes sense that he would think in terms of justice to explain these things. Now, in the long run, over the course of history, things even out, right? There's as many days as there are nights. So then you have to ask the question, if we start with an infinite, an unbounded, an aperon, if we start with just the divine, how do these pairs of opposite forces emerge from the infinite to constitute this cosmos? So one reading of Anaximander, particularly Aristotle, says that there's kind of a whirl or a vortex. And if you think about this vortex spinning, think about how centrifugal force works. It would kind of separate. It would separate this prime matter into opposing forces. Now, we'll go ahead and move on to Anaximenes. Anaximenes, the third of the Milesian philosophers, slightly younger than Thales and Anaximander. He privileged air in his cosmology. So in some ways, you might be thinking this is a step backward from Anaximander. Anaximander made, I think, the astute observation that the ultimate principle can't be any one observable element. So let's bracket that. I think what you'll find in Anaximenes is very subtle and interesting. So he privileges air in his cosmology. He says the earth rests on air, similar to how Thales says the earth rests on water. But what's really interesting about Anaximenes is he actually proposes a mechanism to describe how the cosmos could emerge from the deity, how a world system could be formed out of the infinite. So he thought that the unbounded and the world system are interconvertible through a mechanism of condensation and rarefaction, or compression and expansion. So I want you to try this practical experiment, okay? Take your hand, put it in front of your mouth, and breathe on your hand with your mouth wide open, like that. I know I look goofy doing it, but the air is quite warm, right? Now, try again, but this time with your lips almost closed, right? If you blow like that, the air is quite cool. Now, from this observation, Anaximenes thought that condensation, so we condense the stream of air, it's cooler. So condensation corresponds with cooling down, and rarefaction corresponds with heating up, expansion. So he ordered the elements from the most rarefied to the most dense. So we could say subtle to dense. So air, when it becomes a little bit condensed, it becomes wind. When wind becomes a little bit condensed, a little cooler, it becomes clouds. When clouds become a little cooler and a little more condensed, they become water. When water becomes a little cooler and a little condensed, it becomes earth. And when earth becomes a little cooler and a little condensed, it becomes rock. Now, the opposite way here, if we have a rock and we heat it up, it becomes earth. Earth, when it's a little more rarefied, a little more heated up, it becomes water. When we heat up water, it becomes clouds. And think of this, think of boiling water. He can see this happening right in front of his eyes, right? And when clouds are a little more heated up, a little more rarefied, they become wind. Wind becomes air, and air finally becomes fire. So fire, in a way, is even more rarefied air. So this mechanism of rarefaction and condensation, or of expansion and density, this gives an internal coherence to the cosmos, and neither of the two philosophers before him had much of a sophisticated method for showing how the infinite, in this case air, could become finite and vice versa, how this convertibility could take place. Okay. Anaximenes also had these competing forces of cold and hot, wet and dry, similar to Anaximander. And for him, the deity is identified with air. Now, there's an interesting analogy here that the soul is also identified with air. So you may have heard of the expression the breath of life, right? This is a common understanding of life at the time. It would make sense then that breath had something to do with your life. Air had something to do with your life. And so Anaximenes kind of suggests this analogy that the deity vivifies the universe just as the soul vivifies the body. So, in a sense, God is the breath of the universe, and the soul is the breath of the body. Now, this lines up very well with Jewish and Christian theologies here. In Hebrew, ruach is the word for breath, and it essentially means spirit. And we have very similar ideas in Christian theology. So the big idea with Anaximenes here is that he contributed a general theory of physical change. Anthony Kenny says he's a proto-scientist in a way. He uses experiment, like we said, breathing hot air versus cool air. He also notices that changes in quantity. So in other words, the quantity here, I think, is how dense or subtle how compressed a substance is. That underlies changes in quality. But because there's no means of precise measurement, Anaximenes is not quite a scientist yet. So here's Anthony Kenny's assessment of the Milesians. In the modern sense of the word, they were not physicists. They were not myth makers, but they were moving away from myth. They also were not philosophers because they didn't employ conceptual analysis. But Kenny says it's fair to say that they are speculators who mix philosophy, science, and religion. Okay. I don't quite agree with this assessment. I think because I think this is a bit anachronistic because at the time, philosophy, science, and religion aren't separate. So you can't mix them if they're not separate, right? It's a kind of beside the point, I guess. But this is Kenny's position. Now, Hussey says that the core of the Milesian revolution is the development of a reformed theology based on general principles and the correlative vision of a universe governed by universal law. Now, I don't want you to get tripped up by this phrasing here because reformed theology can mean something quite different in different contexts. All this means here is a break from traditional theology based on these general principles of reasoning. And just as we break from traditional religion when we're doing philosophy, we no longer count received sources of wisdom as authoritative as reason itself. There also needs to be an understanding of how the universe is governed by this universal law. And these are the areas where the Milesians really concentrated. Okay, that wraps up the lecture on the Milesians, and we will come back and have a bit of time on the other pre-Socratics.